Okay, so this is our city as it exists right now. Now, before we bring in the Falcon, we want to clean up the scene a little bit because we want to make sure that our animation goes smoothly and we get as much frame rate as we possibly can. We don't want things, skipping around because the system doesn't have enough processing time. So what we're going to do is we're going to hide a couple of these objects. And hopefully you've been working with layers this entire time. So we can just go ahead and start to hide many of these. Now, the only ones that we really want to keep in place here are the default, building apartment, and guide structures layer. Once we have everything hidden, we can now go up to File and Merge. Now, we want to use Merge in this case because we want to take the most straightforward approach to bringing in a complicated character. And so now while XREF can handle the hierarchies and can handle the animations and so forth, we actually want to use Merge in this case because we're pretty much done with the Falcon. We just want to bring them in, make them part of the scene, keep it simple. So we're going to go to Merge, and we're going to open our Falcon. As you'd probably guess, we need all of the objects, so we click OK. And much like with all of our objects in the past, it loads it up right at the origin and brings in the appropriate layer. So what we need to do now is we need to move them generally into the right location or right in place to start the animation. So to do that, we're going to press H on the keyboard to bring up our select by name, and we're going to select our control object. With the control object selected, we're going to move him using our top viewport, zoom in a little bit, and then rotate him about 90 degrees. Now, once you have him generally positioned and oriented, we're going to actually move him in a little bit closer to the building to get a sense of his size. Now, right now, this guy looks a little bit small in this case. I want him to be a little bit more impressive, even if it's not as realistic. So I'm going to just scale him using the control object as my target. So the reason why we can scale here without going through any of the other considerations as we did before is because we're near the end of the pipeline. Because we're at the end of the pipeline and we're not going to be rigging this guy, we're not going to be changing the mesh, we're not going to really even be exporting him at this point, we can actually scale him up without any consequences. So here I'm just going to scale him up by about 50%, just so he's a little bit larger and a little bit easier to see. Okay, so now that he is the proper size, we move him back. Now we could animate this guy much like how we've been animating everything else, by just setting keyframes along the way. However, what we're going to do is we're actually going to use path constraints, much like how we did with the mouse. We're going to define a path that has him swooping down and then back up. So we go over to Create, Shapes, Line. Now before creating your line, you might want to set the initial type and the drag type to smooth. Once you have those set, we just start drawing. Now notice that even though I'm clicking, nothing is being drawn. And we actually encountered this before. And the reason for this is because we've been drawing on a transparent or a hidden layer. So we're going to just delete that object we created. And we're going to go up to our Falcon layer because we kind of want to keep everything connected and together. And so now we're going to draw our shape or our line. Once we have the basics created, we are going to move him to the proper location and start playing with these points. Give it some height. And remember, we want him to swoop down. Now it's important to pay attention to your camera view while setting up this spline. And the reason for that is because something may look good in one view, but not in another. So if you look at this right here, notice how steep that dip is. But over here in the camera, it doesn't look too bad. So you want to make sure that you pay close attention to whatever view is going to be displaying this stuff. So here we want him a little bit higher. I'm going to actually drag that back a little bit, drag him down, move him in a little bit closer. Okay, so here we have a decent path that the bird's going to follow. Of course, we can always modify it afterwards, but let's just get foundation in place. Now we select our control object. And so let's zoom in. And we select our control. We now go up to Animation, Constraints, Path Constraint, and click on the spline. He immediately snaps into place. We get our 2 keyframes as we expect, and then he animates all the way through. Now the one thing to watch out for here is, much like when we were dealing with the mouse, he is not following the path. So underneath the path constraint parameters, we want to turn on follow, and we also want to turn on bank. We want this guy to bank a little bit as he enters the turn. So we're just going to increase this bank amount just a little bit. Here we go. Okay. Now that we have him in place, we can go back to our spline and tweak it. So right here, he's going up too high. I want him to kind of level out a little bit. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. You want to make sure he doesn't clip anything. Okay, he's still actually going a little bit too high for my taste. I want to make it look more like he is going behind the buildings than anything else. Okay, and I don't like the fact that he vanishes from sight for a little bit. So we're going to just take him, move him up, and adjust the other ones as well. Give him a quick playback. All right, so now he is going really fast here. So we need to give ourselves a little bit more time to work with, right? Because 30 seconds just is not enough. He'll just be a blur going through here. So we could do this the same way that we did with the Falcon animation, by holding down Control and Alt, and then right-clicking and dragging on the timeline to give us more space at the end. Or, in this case, kind of have a rough idea of how long I want this entire animation to be. And you should have a plan too, because much like when we were setting up our scene, it's important to plan ahead a little bit. So in this case, since I know the actual length, we're going to go into Time Configuration, which is located in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, right next to your frame number. Within here, we're going to first change that SMPTE to make the time readout a little bit more logical, or a little bit easier on the math. Then we're also going to set the length to 10 seconds. Okay, so now that we have that, we now have a lot more room to work with. Okay, now this guy is still moving through too quickly, and that's because of the initial keyframes that were created for him. So we're going to get out of subobject mode for our spline, and we're going to select our guide, which holds the path constraint. We now have these 2 keyframes, one representing 0% on the path, and one representing 100% on the path. We're going to take it and we're going to drag it all the way down to about 5 seconds. Give this a quick playback. Okay, a little bit too slow, so we're going to move them back to about 4 seconds. Play it back again. Okay, so not bad. Now what we need to do is we need to basically make sure that the animation, the wing flapping, happens correctly. Because right now, it's happening off screen in the first 30 frames. So we only see the end of it. Not exactly what we're looking for here. So we're going to move the object forward a little bit, double click on our control box so that we have all the keyframes, and then kind of move them back roughly to where we want him to flap down, just right about here. Now one thing to watch out for here is that we do not want to modify the keyframes for our path. We have the timing on the path how we want it. So we need to deselect our control object. So we just hold down Control and click on the control object. We now have only the bone rotations for our Falcon. We can take these, just kind of reposition them so that we get what we want. And so in this case, what we're seeing here is something more like a gliding effect, which may be exactly what we want. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to go up to File and Save Our Work. Okay, we want to make sure that from this point on, we have kind of like a snapshot or a way to go back. Because we may find out that after adding multiple flaps in here, that we actually like this original version. And it'd be a lot easier to just load up the file again, as opposed to deleting all the keyframes that we just created. Okay. So now that we've saved it, we want to loop this animation. We want this animation to be constantly happening as he flaps through the environment. So with our bones still selected, we go up to our graph editors and our track view curve editor. We still have our object selected. We're going to go to the out of range types. Okay, so the out of range types will basically take the existing animations that we have here, or the existing keyframes, and propagate those after the last keyframe and before the first keyframe using these methods that we have here. And so in this case, we just want it to be loop. Click OK. You can see it replicates it all the way down. So now let's play it back and see how it is. Okay, so not too bad. So he flaps down again, right around there, which will be good, and then he leaves the scene. Okay, so this is looking okay. Now what we want to do is we want to preview this. We want to test this out to make sure that the motion is exactly how we want. We may want to scale our timelines, kind of like make them shorter or make it longer so that the flapping either happens only once, only twice, or it happens very quick, or it takes a lot longer. So right now when I'm playing it back in the viewport, I'm not entirely sure I'm getting the full speed of my animation. Because remember, you want it to play back at least 30 frames a second, or at least whatever your target frame rate is. So in this case, I'm going to press 7 on the keyboard to bring up my statistics and then play it back. Okay, so you can see I'm getting about 10 frames per second, meaning that I'm losing some of the information as it goes across the scene. It's basically jumping or skipping frames as it's playing back. So in order to see this properly, we can either A, hide more objects, or B, we can use a previewing function within 3D Studio Max. So let's actually use the previewing function.